Good morning, everybody. My name is Omar DeGuzman. I'm with NES. I am the Environmental Health and Safety Training Manager here, also one of the instructors. Today's webinar subject matter is heat illness prevention. If you notice on this first title page here, we have a download the presentation link. It is available for download. It'll be available on our website as well as far as the recording after today. So we're going to go ahead and get started as folks are checking in. Again, please mute yourself as you do sign in so we can limit that background noise. Okay. Objectives of today's class. So this webinar today does not fulfill the training requirements that are located in the regulations, but it is a great supplement. At the end of the course as well, again, you are able to download this webpage, the slide deck, the recording as well. Also at the end of the class, I will provide some links that are available to you for resources. Okay. Again, the resource packet that is downloadable, you could print that out, and you could also have that in your hands if you wish. So objectives of this webinar today. As noted here, Cal-OSHA, right? We'll talk about California regulations, as well as I'll mention federal regulations and what their requirements are. But as stated here, the Cal-OSHA requires that employers whose employees work in hot environments prepare a heat illness prevention program. Also, employees are also required to receive training regarding heat illness and prevention. Today's outline, we will cover and talk about signs and symptoms of heat-related illnesses, the provisions regarding Title VIII California Code of Regulations 3395 to include access to water and shade. We'll talk about high heat procedures. We will talk about emergency response procedures, training requirements, and then the last section of this webinar, depending on time, I will have for questions. So on that note, you do have the capability to text questions in your dialog window. So if you could please, let's save any questions for the end of the webinar, and I will scan through that chat box and answer any questions again at the end of the presentation. The first section we're going to cover are signs and symptoms of heat illness. Right? Obviously, there's multiple factors that could lead to heat illness, to include your age, weight, health, your physical fitness, previous medical conditions that you may have, or current medical conditions, the use of alcohol and or drugs, the type of clothing, to include personal protective equipment and clothing that you might be wearing when you're out in the field. So some of the first few signs and symptoms of heat illness, one includes heat fatigue. I'm sure we've all felt this before, right? This is why we have this webinar at the beginning months of the year, so we can prepare for the summer months. But as far as heat fatigue, obviously that's impaired in performance caused by the lack of proper acclimatization to the environment, right? And what the treatment is, or what is the treatment? Third bullet point states there is no treatment other than removing yourself from that hot environment. Again, this is what we are known to do when this weather starts warming up, even though we can't tell what's going on now. As the temperatures start to rise, we feel the differences in the heat, which entails for us to be removed from the heat and take a little rest and get some water. Right. The fourth bullet point, the first sign of heat fatigue, again, we want to remove that employee from that hot environment before a more serious condition develops. Heat rash is the next stage. Right. This is one of the most common problems in the work environments. Rashes typically appear when the clothing is restrictive and at areas of unevaporated sweat. Right. What happens? Right. It's a redness in the skin. We have sweaty skin as well. At this point, I have to ask, what are the first aid measures with the heat rash? How do we fix heat rash? Again, removing ourselves from the heat. And as far as those sweaty areas and the redness in the skin, possibly even blisters, we want to dry that affected area out. Obviously, again, cool down break, get some water in your system, and this will help the heat rash. And like it says, the third bullet point, heat rashes typically disappear when the individual is moved to that cool environment. Okay. Next stage in a heat illness is heat cramps. Right? And this can result from the hard physical labor in a hard environment caused by heavy sweating, inadequate electrolyte replacement. What are the signs to look for if you've ever had that heat cramp? Right? We know what those muscle spasms feel like. It's the pain in the extremities, such as your hands, the feet, the abdomen, typically in the back of the leg as well. Again, I go back to first aid measures, and then I ask everybody that's in attendance today, who of you have taken the first aid CPR class, right? We will talk about emergency procedures and what do we do, but in this case, for these illnesses, what do we do for a heat cramp? In this case, to minimize it, like the last bullet point says, is, right, again, it's still just like the regulations state, water, rest, shade. So in this case, right, we remove the employee from the heat, having them take that break, replacing the electrolytes like it says. Water is great. Mix in the electrolytes, mix in the sports drinks. You don't want to drink the sports drinks all day, every day, but water is best. So at the same time, we obviously want to stretch that cramp out. You might have heard eating, replacing with potassium like a banana. That also minimizes the cramps. Okay. Next stage, heat exhaustion, caused by increased stress on various parts of the body, including inadequate blood circulation due to cardiovascular insufficiency or dehydration. Right? What are the signs and symptoms here? From the headaches, the thirst, the fainting, the weakness, heavy sweating. At this point, like it says in the second bullet point, employees suffering from heat exhaustion should immediately be removed from this hot environment again, replace the fluids like I mentioned before, getting the rest. So, we'll talk about shade, but getting removed from that hot environment, what is your shade? Is it escaping to an air conditioning building? Is it an AC in your vehicle? Is it just typically a shade outside under a tree? We'll talk about the definition of shade according to the regulations. But again, we want to remove this person from that hot environment, replacing the fluids. At this point, it's heavy sweating. We want to replace those fluids. And if you're truly showing the signs and symptoms of heat exhaustion, to include the fainting and the weakness and the nausea, well, again, I fall back to your first aid training. How do you cool someone down if they're showing the signs and symptoms of this? At this point, hopefully you have obviously water. If we could get some water droplets on top of this person and get some air movement over those water droplets, that'll help cool that person's body temperature down. At the same time, small bags of ice, activated cold packs or cold compresses. Again, our elevated body temperatures are above our normal body temperature of 98.6, not allowing our body to cool itself down. So we have to do outside measures to cool the body down. The cold ice packs, the cold compresses, those are going to be placed in the neck area, in the armpit, and in the groin area. That is the fastest way to cool down someone's body temperature. Again, out of the heat, get into the shade, and replacing the fluids only if they're responsive, right? The key point again, if they're responsive. If they're unresponsive, again, you got to fall back to your first aid CPR skills, checking for breathing. You might have to get into CPR. Right? We are at extreme temperatures again, or body temperatures, I should say. We really need to monitor this person, and this person may have to receive some type of medical care at this point. Next stage, the most dangerous stage of them all. This is the deadly stage. This is heat stroke. right? And this is the temperature regulation fails and the body temperature rises to critical levels. Again, normal body temperature 98.6, right? Like it says in that one of the lines there, we're elevated body temperatures at 105. Our body cannot cool itself down. This is the most serious of all temperature-related disorders or conditions. This is a 911 emergency. Right? Immediate action should be taken to cool the body before serious injury or death occurs. Again, the signs and symptoms, it's red, hot, usually dry skin at this point. We have nothing left to sweat. Right? Your skin is hot to the touch. This person is going to have difficulty breathing, rapid pulse, dizziness, confusion, nausea. Again, the elevated body temperatures. And then what's the fix? Right? Same thing as the previous. Water, rest, shade. We get them out of that hot environment. With signs and symptoms of heat stroke, if you're at this stage, they might go unresponsive. Again, we got to think about, okay, do we provide something cold to drink or cool to drink? If they're unresponsive, this becomes a choking hazard. So we cool down the body, like I mentioned before, the ice, the cold packs in those main artery areas of the body, the water droplets on the skin, getting some air movement over those water droplets. You got to think about the PPE that employee might be working as well. You might have to remove the restrictive clothing and get some air movement over their bare skin. Okay, again, 911 emergency at this point. They need to seek medical attention right away. Okay. Again, immediate medical attention at this point. In the shade, remove the outer clothing, wet the skin, and increase air movement, like I mentioned. Provide fluids, again, once again, if responsive. At the same time, at the very last bullet point, we never leave someone with heat stroke unattended. We have to monitor the signs and symptoms just in case they do go unconscious, and then we have to provide additional care. Heat stress in general, right? Training is this essential element of this an effective temperature program. Again, we'll talk about that written program. Workers who are able to identify the symptoms of early heat stress, from fatigue to exhaustion to stroke, or even backing up to the heat rash, will be able to prevent these heat-related disorders or conditions and possible death to themselves and fellow workers. And again, we'll talk about that written program where it states, okay, the workers do truly need to identify the signs and symptoms of heat stress and then know what to do. Some general precautions to prevent heat stress, right? Staying hydrated. We've heard that before, right? Best way to avoid a heat stroke or the other heat-related disorders is to keep your body well hydrated, right? Don't wait till your body tells you it's thirsty. You're supposed to be sipping water throughout the day. Like it says, drink a lot of water if you're exercising or working in hot conditions. Recommendation, 8 or more glasses of water a day. Along with be mindful of, and we saw before from medications, read the directions on your prescription medications. Some of the medications state stay out of direct sunlight. At the same time, watch your alcohol intake, watch your caffeine intake. That could lead to dehydration as well. As far as ventilation, remain in cool areas where your body can cool itself. And if you're working in hot conditions, try to take a break to regain that energy and avoid overexposure to the sun. As far as your clothing, we have PPE requirements we have to think of, and those could obviously increase heat stress on your body. But now they have, the nice loose fitting clothing out there, the moisture wicking material, polyester is back. This helps your body breathe and cool itself as well. Additional precautions, obviously limit yourself. Don't overdo it. Again, listen to your body. Listen to the signs and symptoms of your body and in one another. Like it says, heat stroke and other disorders can take effect in less than an hour. So if you're feeling warm or dizzy, it is best to take that time to rest. And then ask yourself, are you fit to work during the summer? Right? As far as the last bullet point, older employees, your health, new employees and personnel. I mentioned the medication. Obviously, they're at great risk if they decide to work during hot, very hot, and or humid conditions. Next section we're going to get into is the regulations, Title 8, California Code of Regulations 3395, and the heat illness standard. Okay. Recently, I attended a safety symposium that was actually put on by Cal-OSHA Enforcement and Standards Board, and they did a great presentation on upcoming regulations that pass, and then they also shared their top 10 citations in construction industry and in general industry. So I got this information from them, and if you take a look, the top 10 in construction, their number one cited citation was truly that heat illness written plan, right? The written program. Again, we'll see elements of that later on in this webinar, but top number one in construction was that written plan. We'll see the terms effective, right? Because just about every written program must be effective. You have to implement it, and it must be effective. So that is what they're finding out there, is not having a written plan nor being effective. Number two, the IIPP, the Injury Illness Prevention Program. I'll briefly talk about that and how it relates to this heat illness program as well. Basically, this heat illness prevention program could be implemented into your IIPP. It could be part of your IIPP. Again, we'll see some slides of that later on this morning as well. Code of Safe Practices, first aid training. All right, I brought that up in the first couple of slides. How many of us have that first aid CPR training? It was the lack of having a first aid trained personnel on site in certain instances, right? Not able to recognize the signs and symptoms, not able to contact emergency services, and just not knowing what to do out in the field. Number 5 was reporting a serious injury. Right, we've seen in the past, in about 2005, 2006, when this standard first came out, multiple fatalities in agriculture, which stemmed the regulation. When there's too many deaths with our field workers, so many stories that were out there, and the lack of reporting. So hopefully everyone knows the timeline in which a serious injury or fatality should be reported to Cal-OSHA. Okay, or shall be reported to Cal-OSHA. Code of Safe Practices, fall protection, rebar caps is number 8. And then number 9, right? It comes up in 2 times in their top 10 for construction, the lack of training for heat illness. Again, this presentation can supplement your training, but there it is there. Comes in twice in the top 10 for construction, the written plan itself, and then at number 9, the lack of training for heat illness. And then number 10, again, first aid kits and what's required out there. I mentioned the cold activated packs. I mentioned small bags of ice. If you're working remotely, do you have access to that? How are you going to cool this employee down if they truly show signs and symptoms of heat illness? So that's construction. General industry, right? That's GISO, General Industry Safety Orders. Again, shared with me or shared with that symposium. Here's the top 10 for general industry, right? In this case, it's reverse order, number 1 and 2. Number 1 being the IIPP. Again, they mention effective written program. Number 2, here's that heat illness prevention plan, right? Either lacking of it or lacking elements of that written plan or not being effective, right? Number 3, reporting a serious injury again. HAZCOM, air tank permits. Number 6, IIPP self-inspections, right? That's one of the elements in the injury illness prevention program is self-inspections and the lack of employers of not doing their self-inspections. Number 7, emergency eye wash and showers, energy control, fire extinguishers, and again, first aid kits, approved first aid kits, depending on what industry or what type of workplace you have, you need to have approved first aid kits by a physician, right? Physician approved first aid kits. Okay. So again, information shared with me of Cal-OSHA enforcement consultation and standards board provided this information. So I thought it was just great information to share out there, especially being heat illness prevention multiple times in both industries. Okay. So elements or prevention elements, kind of what I mentioned, right? Part of your heat illness prevention program shall include access to water and shade, and spelled out, right? High heat procedures, written procedures, including emergency response. We'll talk about that. Acclimatization procedures, employee and supervisory training. So we will talk about all of these elements. So access to water. What does it state in the regulation? Employers shall provide cool, potable drinking water, right? Must be made available to all employees, free of charge, in sufficient quantities, right? And what is the sufficient quantities? Depending on how many employees you have that are working in outdoors, right, in the hot environment, enough to provide at least 1 quart per employee per the entire shift, right? 1 quart per employee per hour for the entire shift, which equates to 2 gallons of water per person for an 8-hour shift. So access to water, whether it's just escaping into your building, access to water there, or do we bring the igloos with ice out to the fields, out to outdoors on our trucks? We just need access to water. Also requires companies to implement, maintain effective replenishment procedures when beginning a shift with quantities of drinking water less than what would be needed to get through the entire shift. So access to water. Again, another story that was shared with me is having enough water for the crew until lunch, and then reassessing at lunch, and then going to the store to buy some more to replenish those supplies. That has to be spelled out in that program, right? If that's the replenishment procedures, is assessing, reassessing at lunch, and going to the store and getting some more, that has to be spelled out in that written program. Okay. Second bullet point, like it says, this should be documented. This should be documented to prove that there's a plan in place in case OSHA does perform an on-site evaluation. Okay. Access to water continued. Locate the water containers as close as practicable, given to the working conditions, and lay it on the work site. Right. Having it readily accessible. We're going to move it with the workers, right? And that's kind of what you see again in agriculture. You'll see the water rest shade, the shade structures, and they follow the crews down the line as they work row to row. So readily accessible. Encouragement of frequent drinking of water too. That's part of that program. Supervisors and employees shall encourage and remind everyone to drink plenty of water. So that was access to water. Access to shade. Definition, according to Cal-OSHA, of shade is blockage of the direct sunlight. Right? Shade is not adequate when the heat in the area of the shade defeats the purpose of the shade. Right? So you go from a hot environment and you escape into your vehicle where the air conditioning has not been running. Right? Well, how hot is it inside the vehicle versus outside temperatures? Right? We know it's a lot harder inside the vehicle than outside, so must be adequate. Okay. Third bullet point: shade may be provided by any natural or artificial means that does not expose the employees to unsafe conditions or discourage access. Right. Again, examples: sitting in the shade of a piece of equipment that's been running that's even hotter than, again, being outside in direct sunlight. Okay. So shade shall be accessible, right, and present when temperatures exceed 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Right, that temperature, that trigger temperature changed a few years ago from 85 to now 80 degrees. So we need access to shade at 80 degrees. And also that shade must be large enough to accommodate the number of employees on the recovery or rest periods. Again, closest practicable to the work area. As far as shade structures, I just mentioned that, enough to accommodate the number of employees on recovery or rest periods and be designed such that employees can sit in a normal posture fully in the shade. So those of us that have those 10 by 10s, depending on how many people you have on the crew, you know, A 10 by 10 can typically cover maybe 7 to 8 people. So is that enough shade to accommodate the employees on that rest period? Another means for access to shade, if the employee is showing signs and symptoms of heat stress, then a cool down rest in the shade for a period of no less than 5 minutes is required. Okay. Again, the shade must not cause exposure to other health or safety hazards. Like I mentioned, up next to a mobile equipment, inside a vehicle that has the air conditioning has not been running, right? That's an additional safety hazard. It's not cooling. It's not serving the purpose of cooling the person down. So if an employee shows the signs and symptoms, they are allowed that no less than 5 minutes of rest, cool down rest, in order to recover. So that was 80 degrees, access to shade. 95 degrees. Well, when the temperature equals or exceeds 95 degrees, they have what they call a high heat procedures. In this case, these procedures have to kick in when we're hovering at those upper temperatures, and the procedures are including effective communication, right? Meaning we're going to communicate to the employees that we're at elevated temperatures and we have to follow our heat illness prevention program to include the access to water, reminding everybody where the shade is, reminding everybody to drink water frequently. Number 2, we need to also observe the employees for alertness and signs and symptoms of heat illness, whether that's deemed by a competent person that's on site or your supervisor that's on site, or each other, right? We need to watch one another for the signs and symptoms of heat illness that we discussed earlier. Continuing with these procedures, number 3, we have to designate one or more employees on each work site as authorized to call for EMS, emergency medical services, and allow for other employees to call emergency services when no designated employees is available. Number 4, remind employees throughout the work shift to drink plenty of water again. And then tailgate meetings is number 5, right? Pre-shift meetings before commencement of work to review what your written procedures are, to review the high heat procedures, again, encouraging employees to drink plenty of water and reminding them to take a cool down rest break if they're feeling the signs and symptoms of heat stress. Okay. Next up is emergency response procedures. And what the procedures state is we have to ensure that effective communication by voice, observation, or electronic means is maintained so that employees at the worksite can contact either a supervisor or EMS. Okay. Number 2, determine some type of protocol for responding to possible heat illness and how EMS will be provided. Number 3, determine protocol for contacting emergency medical services, and if necessary, transporting employees to a place where they can be reached by an emergency medical provider, to include clear, precise directions to the work site, and can and will be provided as needed. So again, stem from agriculture. You could think of someone again working remotely, someone in an orchard or a field. And getting EMS to that exact location was difficult. So these emergency procedures have to be spelled out. Examples that were given to me, again, working in remote locations, is multiple employees, if there's a signs and symptoms, or we had a heat illness related injury or illness, someone would stay with the employee like we saw earlier. Someone would run down or drive down to the edge of the field. Another person would go down to an entry gate and use a spotting flagging system in order to get EMS to that injured employee. So again, emergency response procedures have to be spelled out in that written program as well. Okay. Acclimatization. These procedures as well have to be spelled out. Employers are responsible for the working conditions of their employees, and so must act effectively when conditions result in sudden exposure to heat that the workers are not used to. Thus, the employer must determine how the company will, right? So this would be a form of administrative controls, how we are going to acclimate that new employee to this hot environment. In this case, some of the examples given here are lessen the intensity or the shift length of that newly hired employee, right, during this first 2-week period. So the first 3 days, as an example, right, we expose this new employee to outdoor heat for 3 hours a day. The next few days, we extend that timeline to maybe 3/4 day. The following week, okay, if we think their body is acclimated to the heat, we could extend their work shift to a full work shift. So again, that has to be spelled out, these procedures. How are you going to acclimate that new employee? Like it says, during hot summer months, modify the work schedule or reschedule non-essential duties. Also, it says, right, be extra vigilant with employees to immediately recognize, again, the signs and symptoms of possible heat illness. As far as the training elements, training must cover the following topics, right? How are you going to prevent heat illness? Procedures for complying with the standard. Access to water, access to shade, acclimatization procedures need to be spelled out. Again, what are the signs and symptoms of heat illness, reporting heat illness, and then emergency response procedures. So this includes supervisors, this includes employees. So everyone must receive this training, and here are the must-cover topics. To continue with supervisor training, right? Again, in addition to the previously mentioned elements of that training program, supervisors are also to track the weather of the job site by monitoring predicted temperature highs. Whether it's phone apps, there's a picture there in the corner. NIOSH actually has a heat safety tool app that you could download for free. It'll locate where you are, and it'll give you the high heat temperatures along with humidity, and it'll tell you what the risk factor is for that day. Second bullet point says, right, we use weather information to, again, modify the work schedule, increase the number of water rest breaks, or, if need be, cease work entirely. Again, supervisor training. Okay. I mentioned this in the beginning, right? Heat illness prevention plan. This can be integrated into your injury illness prevention program. As far as this plan, maintain the plan procedures on site or as close to the site so they can be made available to employees. Okay. Again, detail how your company will provide access to water and shade, how your company is going to institute high heat procedures, address acclimatization procedures as well, how your company is going to train all employees and its supervisors, along with how are you going to respond to heat illnesses without delay. Again, I did mention, are your employees trained in first aid CPR? Can they respond correctly? And notify emergency services. What are their means of communication? References. Obviously, the Cal-OSHA's website, if you've been there, they have multiple pages, not only just the regulations, but also attached to this student resource packet are sample procedures that are provided by Cal-OSHA. They have a publication there for heat illness sample procedures. So it's kind of like a template, a plug-and-play template. But again, as we saw in the top 10, that written program must be effective. My mistake. Another link that I provided is a heat illness prevention page, also on Cal-OSHA's website. They have e-tools on site. They have videos posted on there as well. Another link that I referenced was the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, CDC's website. They have a nice page on heat stress that's available. Again, heat illness prevention are the basic elements that I covered today. I will now open up the presentation for questions, if anybody had any questions.